Heavy rain hammered against the glass walls of the billionaire's mansion. The kind of rain that feels like a warning. Inside, family members sat frozen around a long dining table worth more than most people's homes. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The chandeliers above cast a cold light across faces that had not been in the same room together in 7 long years. At the head of the table sat Richard Cole, 72 years old, self-made billionaire, founder of Cole Industries, and a man who had spent a lifetime being right about everything. Or so he believed. And standing in front of him was the son he had abandoned 7 years earlier. The same son who once gave up everything. His dreams, his savings, his future, to save the family. The same son Richard publicly called a failure. Now he stood there in silence. Different, colder, more powerful. And in his hand was a document that made Richard's trembling hands tell a story his pride would never allow his mouth to speak. 7 years earlier, Richard Cole made a choice. He chose the son who smiled the brightest, the son who drove the fastest car, the son who made him feel like a winner at every dinner party. He chose Jason over Daniel. And in doing so, he handed the keys of his empire to a man who would burn it to the ground. But on this night, in this room, with the rain coming down like God himself was grieving, Richard Cole would realize something that no amount of money could fix. He had destroyed the only person in his family who truly, unconditionally loved him. And before Richard Cole fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness, something happened inside that mansion that nobody in that family ever saw coming. Something that would change all of them forever. Before we go any further, and I want you to stay with me on this because this story is going to get deep, before we dive into what happened on that rainy night, we need to go back. We need to understand who Daniel Cole really was. We need to understand what he sacrificed and why. We need to understand what made Richard, a man of intelligence and discipline, turn so completely against the very son who held the family together. And we need to understand the secret. A secret that Elena, the mother, carried quietly for years. The kind of secret that only comes out when someone is dying and realizes they have run out of time. Why did the older son sacrifice everything while the younger son lived like a king? What made the billionaire blind to what was happening right in front of him? What did Jason do with the empire his brother saved? And what exactly was inside that document Daniel brought back to that dining table 7 years later? These are not small questions. Because this is not a small story. This is a story about what happens when a parent mistakes confidence for character and silence for weakness. And it is a story that, if you are honest with yourself, you may recognize from your own life. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Money can buy loyalty, can buy smiles, yes men, and applause, but it cannot buy love. And Richard Cole was about to learn the difference between all of those things in the most painful way imaginable. Richard Cole did not inherit wealth. He built it. Born in a small town in Ohio, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, Richard grew up watching his father come home every night smelling of motor oil and exhaustion. He swore early that he would never live that life. And he did not. By the time he was 34, he had founded Cole Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing and logistics company that would grow over 3 decades into one of the most recognized names in the Midwest. Richard built his empire on 3 principles: discipline, decisiveness, and results. He had no patience for softness, no room for sentiment. He once fired a manager who cried during a performance review. Emotions, Richard used to say, are what poor people use instead of strategy. He meant it. When Richard met Elena during a business trip to Chicago, he was 40 years old. She was 32, quiet, warm, the kind of woman who noticed things other people walked past. She noticed when the waiter at the restaurant looked tired. She noticed when the flowers in the hotel lobby needed water. She noticed Richard before he noticed her, and she saw in him something that he did not often show the world. A loneliness so deep it had calcified into ambition. They married within 18 months. 2 sons followed. Daniel, the elder, arrived in the 2nd year of their marriage. Jason came 4 years later. From the very beginning, the 2 boys were different in ways that went far beyond personality. Daniel was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. Still on the surface, everything happening underneath. He was the boy who finished his homework before being asked, who helped his mother carry groceries up the driveway, who stayed late after school to help his teacher reorganize the classroom. He was not flashy. He was not loud. He did not perform for approval. And that, as it turned out, was his greatest problem in a household run by a man who valued performance above everything else. Jason was different. Jason had the gift of presence. He walked into rooms and people noticed. He laughed easily, talked smoothly, and had his father's jawline and his father's eye for opportunity. When Jason was 12 years old, he sold homemade lemonade at the end of the driveway and turned it into a small neighborhood operation within a week. Richard saw that and beamed with pride. He told the story at dinner parties for years. Daniel, sitting at the same dinner table during those stories, said nothing. He had learned early that silence was safer than competing for something that had already been decided. Think about that for a moment. Can you imagine being a child in your own home, working hard, being responsible, being present, and still feeling invisible? Can you imagine watching your father's eyes light up for someone else every single time? Because that was Daniel's childhood. Not dramatic, not abusive, just quietly, consistently overlooked. And that kind of wound does not bleed. It just hollows you out slowly over years. Elena saw it. She always saw it. On nights when Richard would praise Jason at dinner, telling him he had the instincts of a winner, she would catch Daniel's expression across the table. Not anger, not jealousy, just a flicker of something that looked like a child quietly accepting a verdict. After dinner, she would find reasons to sit near Daniel, help him with his homework, ask about his day in a way that made him feel like his answers mattered. She could not fix what Richard was doing, but she tried to fill the gaps he left behind. By the time Daniel was 17, he had quietly taken on small responsibilities inside coal industries during school breaks, organizing files, helping the accounting team during tax season, learning the systems. Nobody asked him to do it. He just showed up. Richard noticed but said little. "Good initiative," he said once, passing Daniel in the hallway. That was the closest thing to praise Daniel received from his father during those years. 2 words, delivered without eye contact, to a boy who had spent years trying to earn them. Jason, at 13, got a brand new car simulation game for Christmas that year. Richard sat with him on the living room floor for 2 hours playing it together. Daniel watched from the top of the stairs. He went back to his room and finished a report he was preparing voluntarily for his father's operations team. He left it on Richard's desk the next morning. Richard never mentioned it. Daniel was 23 when the first real cracks appeared in coal industries. He was working as a junior analyst inside the company by then, not because Richard promoted him, but because enough senior staff had noticed his work ethic and quietly advocated for his placement. Richard allowed it without comment. That same year, Richard made a significant investment decision, a bold move into a new freight logistics partnership that several of his senior advisors quietly flagged as risky. Richard dismissed their concerns. He had built a company on bold moves. This, he said, was no different. He was wrong. Within 14 months, the partnership collapsed. A combination of mismanaged contracts, hidden liabilities, and a partner company that had been overstating its assets brought the whole arrangement down. Coal industries lost close to $40 million in a span of weeks. The media picked up the story fast. Headlines that had once praised Richard Cole as a visionary now questioned his judgment. Investors got nervous. Suppliers started calling in early payments. The company that Richard had spent 30 years building was, for the first time in its history, genuinely at risk. Richard, privately, was terrified. Not that he would ever show it. He held press conferences in which he projected calm. He gave interviews in which he spoke confidently about the company's resilience. But behind closed doors, in the silence of his office at 11 at night, he was staring at balance sheets that did not balance. And during all of this, while Jason was at a resort in Miami with friends, Richard was still funding. Daniel was in the office. Every morning, often through the night. He had begun working quietly with the CFO and 2 senior managers to develop a restructuring plan. He identified contracts that could be renegotiated. He found suppliers willing to extend payment terms if approached correctly. He drafted a refinancing proposal that 3 external consultants later called remarkably sophisticated for someone his age. He did not announce any of this. He just did it. Then Elena got sick. The timing was the kind that feels deliberately cruel, as if life decided that one catastrophe was not enough. She was diagnosed with a serious cardiac condition that required immediate intervention and ongoing treatment. The hospital bills came quickly and they came hard. Elena had always insisted on maintaining her own modest savings, separate from Richard's wealth, out of a lifelong instinct for independence. But those savings were not enough. And Richard, in the chaos of the company crisis, had temporarily frozen several family accounts while restructuring personal finances. The bills sat unpaid. The hospital sent notices. Elena said nothing to Richard. She did not want to add to his burden. She told only Daniel. Daniel found out on a Tuesday evening when Elena called him from a hospital waiting room. Her voice carefully controlled, trying to make it sound like she was simply updating him. He heard the fear underneath. He drove to the hospital that night. He sat with her for 3 hours. He held her hand while she explained the situation in careful, minimizing terms that broke his heart because he could see exactly how much she was trying not to alarm him. When he left that hospital, Daniel made several decisions. He sold the investment portfolio he had been building quietly since he was 19. He took out a personal loan against it. He paid the outstanding hospital bills in full the following week and set up an account to cover Elena's ongoing treatment. He told nobody, not Richard, not Jason, not even Elena, until she found the receipt by accident 3 weeks later and called him crying. He told her it was nothing. She knew it was everything. Meanwhile, at Cole Industries, Daniel's restructuring plan was beginning to show results. The CFO presented elements of it to Richard, crediting the team. Richard approved the changes without asking who originated them. The bleeding began to slow. Investor confidence began to stabilize. The company was not saved yet, not by a long way, but it was no longer in freefall. Richard stood before the board and accepted their gratitude. He spoke about leadership and resilience. He mentioned the team. He did not mention Daniel by name once. Ask yourself something honestly. If you were Daniel, if you had sold your savings, paid your mother's medical bills, worked through the night to stabilize your father's company, and then watched your father take credit for the recovery without acknowledging you, what would you have felt? Would you have stayed? Would you have said something? Or would you have done what Daniel did, which was to say nothing, go back to your desk and keep working? Because that is who Daniel was. And it is also, in a painful way, why what came next hurt so much. 6 months after the company began to stabilize, Richard called a family dinner. Elena came down from upstairs, still recovering, moving a little slower than she used to. Jason flew in from wherever he had been. Richard had never stopped funding his lifestyle despite the crisis, a fact that Daniel had noted and said nothing about. They sat around the dining room table and Richard made his announcement. He was formalizing the succession plan for Cole Industries. He was naming Jason as the designated future CEO. The room was quiet for a moment. Elena looked at her plate. Daniel looked at his father. Richard did not look at either of them. He looked at Jason, who smiled the smile of a man who had been expecting this and was gracious enough to perform mild surprise. Richard spoke about Jason's charisma, his instincts, his natural leadership energy. He spoke for 4 minutes. He did not mention Daniel once. Daniel sat at that table and did not move. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He did not point to the restructuring plan or the hospital bills, or the nights he had spent in that office while Jason was posting photos from beach clubs. He simply folded his napkin neatly, placed it beside his plate, and excused himself to get some water from the kitchen. He stood at the kitchen counter for 2 minutes with his back to the doorway. Elena came in behind him. She placed her hand on his back and said quietly, "I'm sorry." He turned around and looked at her with an expression she would describe years later as the look of a person who has just accepted something they never wanted to accept. He said, "It's okay, Mom." She knew it wasn't. 3 weeks later, Richard asked Daniel to step back from his operational role. He framed it as restructuring responsibilities. He said Daniel's skills might be better applied elsewhere. He suggested Daniel consider a consulting role, advisory, without authority, without ownership. Daniel stood in his father's office and listened to this calmly. Then he said, "All right, Dad." He left the office. He went home. He packed 1 suitcase, just one, and left the family home the next morning before anyone else was awake. He left a note for his mother on the kitchen counter. It said, "I love you. Take care of yourself. I'll be okay." He left nothing for Richard. Nobody stopped him. Richard did not call. Jason sent a brief text 2 days later that said, "Hey, heard you left. Hope you're good." Daniel did not reply. He drove to a small apartment he had rented 2 weeks earlier, because some part of him, some quiet, clear-eyed part of him, had known this was coming. He sat on the floor of that empty apartment, his back against the wall, his one suitcase beside him, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel it. The grief, the exhaustion, the particular, devastating pain of being erased by the person whose approval you spent your whole life trying to earn. He sat there for a long time. Then he got up, ordered a cheap pizza, found a second-hand desk on a local buy-and-sell app, and started making a list of everything he still knew how to do. Think about that image. A man who saved an empire, sitting alone on a bare floor with a suitcase and a list. That is where loyalty without recognition leads. That is what happens when love is treated as something that has to be performed for an audience to count. And now ask yourself, have you ever given everything to someone who acted like it cost you nothing? Have you ever been Daniel? What happened next did not look like a comeback. Not at first. The first 18 months were genuinely hard. Daniel found contract work, consulting for small businesses in financial trouble, the kind of clients who could not afford the big firms. He charged reasonable rates. He was thorough and honest. He did not promise miracles. He delivered results. Word spread in the way that only real results spread. Slowly, person to person, without marketing or noise. A small manufacturer in Cincinnati hired him to restructure their supplier contracts and saw their costs drop by 22% in 1 quarter. A logistics startup in Indianapolis brought him in to fix an operations crisis and came out the other side with their first profitable year. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. But he was building something real, one client at a time, in the way he had always done everything, quietly, thoroughly, without fanfare. Meanwhile, at Cole Industries, Jason was settling into his role with the energy of someone who had been handed something and had no real understanding of what it cost. He made fast decisions. He surrounded himself with people who agreed with him. He pursued glamorous expansion moves, new markets, flashy partnerships, a rebrand that cost more than it returned. In the first year, the numbers looked acceptable. Richard praised him publicly. The second year brought more concerning signs. Margins tightening, key staff leaving quietly, clients expressing concerns that were politely logged and not addressed. Richard explained each warning sign away. He had built this company on bold moves. Jason was bold. This would be fine. Elena watched from upstairs, getting a little older, a little more tired. She had Daniel's number saved on her phone under a contact name she had changed to My Strength, so that Richard would not recognize it if he ever saw her screen. She called Daniel every few weeks. They talked about her health, his work, a book she was reading. She never asked him to come back. She knew what it had cost him to leave, and she would not ask him to carry that weight again. But in one phone call, about 2 years after he had left, she said something that stayed with him. She said, "Daniel, I need you to know something. I kept every letter you sent me. Every single one. I have them in a box in the back of my closet. And when I read them, I know exactly who my son is." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thanks, Mom." He meant it in a way that language does not fully reach. 3 years after Daniel left, Cole Industries began to show serious structural problems. The expansion moves Jason had championed were underperforming. 2 major clients, relationships Daniel had helped build years earlier, quietly moved their contracts to competitors. A senior financial officer resigned and, in his resignation letter, raised concerns about decision-making processes that were later reviewed by the board. Jason responded to all of it with confidence and dismissiveness in equal measure. Richard backed him publicly and questioned the concerns privately. The board grew cautious. By year 4, the company's debt load had grown significantly. A private equity group that had taken a minority stake began making noise about governance. Auditors flagged irregularities in several expense accounts connected to Jason's division. The word investigation appeared in a board memo. Jason hired expensive lawyers. Richard's name, the name he had spent 30 years building, began appearing in financial news stories that used phrases like under scrutiny and leadership questions. Richard started sleeping less. He started drinking more. Elena, from upstairs, heard him pacing some nights and said nothing. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And then it all broke open at once. It was not a single event. It was a cascade. 3 things happened in the same month, and the combination of them left Richard Cole, a man who had never publicly lost anything, visibly diminished. First, the private equity group moved to force a governance review of coal industries, citing the financial irregularities. Second, a journalist published an investigative piece that traced several of Jason's luxury expenditures back to company accounts. Third, Jason, faced with the formal investigation, liquidated a significant portion of his personal shares and left the country for what he described as an extended working trip. He sent Richard a text message to tell him. Not a phone call, a text. Richard read it sitting in his study at 2 in the morning. He read it 3 times. Then he put the phone down on the desk and sat in silence for a very long time. The board suspended Jason's authority pending the investigation. The company's stock dropped sharply. The same journalists who had once written admiringly about Richard's self-made story now wrote about hubris and blind spots. Former colleagues and business partners stopped returning his calls. The mansion, which had always been full of staff and visitors and noise, became very quiet. Richard moved through its rooms like a man who had forgotten why he built them. He did not call Daniel. Not then. He was still Richard Cole. He still had pride. A pride that had cost him more than he would ever fully calculate. It was Elena who made the call. She was 71 now, weaker. Her cardiac condition had progressed in ways the doctors were monitoring carefully. She called Daniel on a Thursday evening and she did not try to minimize anything. She said, "Daniel, I think it's time. Not for your father. For me. I want to see you. I need to see you." Daniel was on a plane the next morning. He arrived at the mansion on a Friday evening. The rain was coming down hard, the kind of rain that feels like it is trying to wash something away. He had a driver. He was wearing a good suit. He carried a briefcase. When he stepped out of the car and walked up the driveway, he looked different in a way that went beyond clothes or posture. He looked like a man who had made peace with something difficult and come out the other side carrying it rather than being crushed by it. Richard, who had been told Daniel was coming, watched from the window of the study. He could not explain the feeling that moved through him. Not pride, not regret. Something more complicated than either of those words. They sat in the dining room, Richard, Elena, and Daniel. The same long table, the same chairs. Daniel opened the briefcase and placed a document on the table in front of his father. Richard picked it up with hands that were not entirely steady. He read it slowly. When he looked up, his face had changed. Because the document showed that a holding company had, over the past 18 months, quietly acquired the majority of the debt position that was threatening coal industries. The holding company had moved carefully, legally, without drawing attention. And the holding company was controlled by Daniel. Richard stared at his son. He said, almost in a whisper, "You bought our debt?" Daniel said, "I bought Mom's peace of mind. The rest was secondary." The room was silent for a long time. Elena reached across the table and held Daniel's hand. Richard looked at his 2 hands flat on the table. Then he said something he had said to almost no one in his 72 years of living. He said, "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at him for a moment. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with the clarity of a man who had lived long enough in pain to know that hearing those words did not erase anything, but that refusing to hear them would cost him something too. He said, "I know, Dad." He did not say it was fine. He did not say it did not matter. He said, "I know," and somehow that was enough to begin. Elena passed away 4 months later, peacefully, in her room. Daniel was there. Richard was there. She had made sure of that. In the weeks before she died, she had asked Daniel to bring her the box from the back of her closet. He did. Inside were years of letters, every letter he had sent her after he left. Birthday cards with long handwritten notes, a few photographs, receipts from the hospital payments he had made that she had quietly kept. She gave the box to Richard one morning without saying anything. He spent an afternoon alone with it in the study. When he came out, Elena was sitting in the garden, wrapped in a blanket. He sat beside her and they did not speak for a long time. Eventually he said, "Why didn't you show me these sooner?" She looked at him gently and said, "Because you weren't ready to read them." Richard read every letter in that box. Not one of them contained hatred. Not one of them asked for acknowledgement or credit. They were letters from a son who had simply wanted his father to know he was okay, that he was working, that he was thinking of them. The last letter in the box, written about 3 years after Daniel had left, ended with a single line that Richard folded and kept in his jacket pocket for the rest of his life. It said, "I never stopped loving you, Dad. I just stopped waiting for it back." After Elena died, Richard changed. Not dramatically, not performatively, quietly and genuinely, in the way that loss sometimes rearranges a person from the inside. He began donating to programs supporting children from low-income families, anonymously, without press releases. He gave interviews, unprompted, in which he spoke honestly about the mistakes he had made as a father. He said, in one of them, "I spent decades rewarding the loudest voice in the room. I confused visibility with value. I confused charm with character. And the person I hurt most because of that confusion is the person who deserved it least." He was never celebrated for saying these things. He did not say them to be celebrated. Daniel rebuilt coal industries differently. Ethical governance, employee profit sharing, a board with genuine independence. The company did not become the biggest in its sector. It became one of the most respected. The same financial journalists who had written about its collapse later wrote about its unlikely revival. They called it a case study in quiet leadership. They barely mentioned Richard's name. They spent considerable time on Daniel's. He gave one interview about it. When the journalist asked how he had remained motivated through the years of being overlooked and pushed out, Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother kept my letters." Sometimes the strongest people in a room are not the ones doing the most talking. They are the ones who have already decided that their worth is not determined by who recognizes it. Daniel Cole spent years being invisible in a family that claimed to value excellence, while the person the family actually celebrated was running it quietly toward ruin. And the man who built that family, the brilliant, disciplined, self-made Richard Cole, spent the last years of his life understanding that the greatest loss he had ever experienced was not financial. It was not the $40 million. It was not the reputation. It was the years. The years he spent not seeing the son who was right there, working, loving, sacrificing, just not loudly enough to be heard over the noise of his preference. And here is what I want to ask you, because this story deserves more than just watching. What would you have done in Daniel's place? If you had given everything, your savings, your future, your youth, to a family that publicly chose someone else, would you have walked back in? Would you have helped again? Or would the pain have been too deep? And if you are honest, and I am asking you to be honest, is there someone in your life right now who is doing for you what Daniel did for Richard? Someone quiet. Someone who shows up without announcement. Someone whose love you may be overlooking because it does not come with fanfare? Because those people are rare. And losing them, the way Richard almost lost Daniel, is the kind of loss that money cannot fix and time cannot fully heal. If this story moved you, leave the word letters in the comments below. It will tell me that you stayed until the end, and that this story reached you the way it was meant to. Subscribe if you are not already here, because there are more stories like this one. Stories about sacrifice, about loyalty, about what gets seen and what gets overlooked, and about the people who keep going anyway. And remember, the people who deserve love the most are very often the ones who ask for it the least.